silent generation is one of silence, as the people born into this time frame of 1925 to 1941 mainly focused on their work and conformity instead of any activism. This generation is awkwardly placed between two more famous and personality-defining generations, as they just missed their opportunity to become World War II heroes, but were just too early to become New Age firebrands. Children growing up in this generation became a crisis because they were forced to watch their loved ones fight in wars and make great financial sacrifices, like during the Great Depression, which was just hitting the economy in full force as they grew up. The silent generation was sandwiched between two defining generations, but their conformity ideals led the silent into a more enjoyable and stable way of life. My grandma was one of the silent. Barbara Phillips was born May 9th, 1938 in Long Beach, California, to Oval and Thelma Kemp. A common phrase or theme in her house was, "Children should be seen, not heard." This is a quote that she lived by every day. Her parents were always so busy, her mom taking a job as a Sears accountant, and her father kept bouncing around jobs. These jobs ranged from construction to even standing next to his wife as an accountant. But that didn't last very long. My grandma looked up to her mom. She really admired her. She loved how successful her mom was, and she loved how her mom would try to give everything she could into the family. If it was her whole paycheck, if it was any of her leftover time, if it existed, her leftover energy, anything. But as hard as she could try, she was not there enough. World War II affected my grandma's life greatly in an economic sense. Since the U.S. was now involved in World War II, we instigated total war. This mobilization by the U.S. meant that anything was unrestricted in its use and production of weapons, civilians, and territory. Using every resource possible, the citizens of the United States pulled together to try to fund this war waging overseas. On top of this, rations were also instituted. The first foods that were rationed were bacon, butter, and sugar. Later, that was followed by meat, tea, jam, biscuits, breakfast cereals, cheese, eggs, lard, milk, and canned and dried fruit. God provided for my grandmother in a great many ways, as her mom never lost her job during this difficult time. But the rations did take a toll on the family. During one birthday during World War II, my grandma usually got a chocolate cake every birthday, but that was taken away because there wasn't enough supplies to make this cake. During the 1930s and 1940s, there was a low birth rate. This eventually helped the silent in the workforce, though, because since there were less of them, there was more of a demand of the new youth. This affected my grandma, not in her workforce, because she never wanted to go to work, and she never went to school either. She just grew up and became a mom, and that's what she did with her whole life. Since silents were in such a high demand, it was easier for her husband to hold a job to be able to support their 6-people family. Also, because their wages were so high, it allowed them to save up so that when grandma went into retirement, she had money saved up from his job. And to this day, she's still sitting on a big pile of money in a nice home with little worries. Nowadays, it's harder to save up for retirement, so the silents really dodged a bullet. The Cold War. A war against communism, a war of fear. A war that didn't actually end up being a war. Every day my grandma walked 3 miles to and from school. And every day while she was walking, she was terrified of a nuclear attack. Since she was outside for so many miles, what would she do if there was an attack? Where would she go? Since she walked so much, she began to make checkpoints. This is where she would run. She would go hide in the ditch over there. There was a neighbor's house that she would pick sometimes. Or, if there was nothing, she would just pray and hope for the best. Strangely, though, she doesn't remember a lot from the Cold War. All she remembers is the fear. The fear of being in school and hoping and praying that nothing will ever happen to her and her loved ones. She doesn't remember the Korean War very much either. The invasion of South Korea marked the beginning of military involvement into the Cold War by the U.S. The silent generation was really hoping, they were praying that this new Korean War could be the thing, the it factor that defines them as a generation. but it didn't. This prompted the silent generation to stop pining for a war and to define themselves in a different way. So they went back to traditional values and their conformity and decided to start a family. And this is what my grandma did throughout the Korean War. The only person in her family that was drafted was her brother, but he barely got any fighting time because a couple months after he was enlisted, the war was over. My grandfather got out of being drafted because he had a child. Even though every man after 20 was expected to go enlist, many of his friends had looked down on him because they thought he was not doing his duty to his country. But actually, he was doing his duty to his family. Probably the worst moment, but still a highlight in my grandma's life, was November 22nd, 1963, the day that Kennedy was assassinated, but also the day that her daughter, my Aunt Gail, was born. On November 22nd, 1963, about 5 a.m. in Linwood, California, my Aunt Gail was born. This meant that 6 hours after Gail was born, Kennedy was assassinated miles and miles away in Texas. Once word got to the hospital that Kennedy had died, an uproar happened. The whole hospital went crazy. People were running around. Nurses even came in, begging her to change rooms into one with a TV because they wanted to see the news during their shift. She was flustered and she was terrified, but she had to say no to the nice nurses because she couldn't afford that. Her husband couldn't afford that. She wanted to leave, but they wouldn't discharge her, and they didn't discharge her till the following day. Because there was such craziness, her mother had to keep the other children, Sherry the oldest and Neil the middle child, at her house in Anaheim. Barbara was having a horrible day, but she wanted to rejoice because she had a daughter, but the death of Kennedy ruined it all. My grandma was a very family-oriented girl. She wanted to grow up and become a mom and focus on her family. Through all the events that happened around her, they affected her indirectly, but she didn't realize it. She didn't really keep up on current events. She was focused on her family. She didn't want to turn to her parents. Yes, children should be seen and not heard, but children should also be played with. Children shouldn't be left alone to their own devices, and that's what was very important to my grandma. Today, as she sits on her pile of money, as she's in her very nice home, she's still very family-oriented and continues to stay in contact with everyone as much as possible. Her family is number one in her life, next to God. And that is what I love about her.